Your computer is going to ask you to install an update, probably this week, and you are going to say yes. I want to tell you about the day that was the wrong answer. On the 27th of June, 2017, an accounting program in Ukraine pushed a routine update to its customers. Within hours, container ships had no idea what was inside them. A chocolate factory stopped. Hospital records were unreachable on another continent. Estimated global damage, more than $10 billion. It remains, by cost, the most destructive cyber attack ever recorded. In the next half hour, I will show you exactly how it worked, what it did to one company in particular, and the single accident that saved that company. And I will show you why the most expensive part of the whole thing was not the attack. It was an argument about a word in an insurance policy. Start with the software, because the software is the reason this attack was unstoppable, and because it is the least interesting piece of software you will hear about all year. M.E.Doc is a piece of Ukrainian tax accounting software. Unglamorous, specific, and almost mandatory. If you filed taxes in Ukraine as a business, you very likely ran it. That includes the Ukrainian branch of every multinational operating in the country. Hold on to that second sentence, because it is the entire attack, not a clever piece of malware, a correct answer to the question of where everybody happens to be standing. The attackers did not break into Maersk. They did not break into Merck or FedEx or any of the companies that ultimately paid for this. Nobody phished a shipping executive. They broke into the software those companies' Ukrainian offices were legally obliged to run, and then they waited for it to update itself. This is called a supply chain attack, and the name is very dry for something this economical. You compromise one supplier and you inherit every one of that supplier's customers. Think of it as poisoning the delivery van instead of breaking into the houses. You do not need to know who the customers are. The van knows. And every security instinct the company has is pointed in exactly the wrong direction for this, which is what makes it worth half an hour of your time. You are told to install updates promptly. That is correct advice. It is overwhelmingly the right thing to do. You are told not to open attachments from strangers. Nobody tells you to distrust the vendor whose software you already run, because if you cannot trust that, you cannot use computers at all. So the update arrives, signed and expected, from a server the company has trusted for years. Every gate opens, because every gate was built to open for exactly this. The companies that got hit hardest that day were not careless. In several cases, they were hit precisely because they were diligent about updating. That inversion is what makes this attack important, and it is why we are still talking about it 9 years later. It also tells you something about who the target was. Ukrainian tax accounting software is not a lucky find. It is a precision instrument for hitting one specific country and almost nothing else. Everything about the choice says the intended blast radius was one country. And that is exactly where the story stops going to plan, because a blast radius is not something you get to choose after you have lit the fuse. A multinational's Ukrainian office is not an island. It is a fully joined up part of the corporate network, because that is the entire point of having one. Same domain, same credentials, same trusted connections back to headquarters, because that is what makes a multinational function. So the malware arrives on a laptop in Kiev, and from that laptop it can see Copenhagen, and from Copenhagen it can see every other office the company has anywhere in the world. Which brings us to the second half of the design, and the part that turns a national incident into a global one. Getting in was the supply chain. What happened next was something else entirely. Because this thing did not need a second victim to click on anything. Not one. After the first machine, no human involvement was required at any point. Once it was on a single machine inside a network, it moved on its own, machine to machine, at the speed of the network rather than the speed of anybody's inbox. Not hours, and not overnight. Companies describe their entire computing estate going dark in a matter of minutes, while staff watch screens in front of them. There is a reason for that speed, and it is a reason that should make every organization uncomfortable, because it is not really a flaw in the software. It used two different ways to move between machines, and the two of them together are what made it so hard to stop. The first was an exploit, a leaked intelligence service tool made public the previous year that let a machine take over another machine on the same network without a password. I am not going to walk you through how that exploit works, and it genuinely does not matter for what you need to take away. What matters is one fact about it. It had already been patched. Months earlier, the fix had been available since March, and this was June. That is the single most repeated lesson of this era of security, and it is repeated because it keeps being true. The exploit was old news to anyone who had applied the update. But an organization with tens of thousands of machines never has every one of them patched. There is always a server that cannot be restarted, a system a vendor will not certify, a machine somebody forgot existed. And in a flat network, one unpatched machine is not one machine. It is a door. That was the first method, and it is the one everybody remembers. If it had been the only one, patching alone would have stopped this attack dead. The second method is the one that made patching insufficient, and it is why this attack still matters. It stole the credentials already sitting on the machine it had just taken, and then used them to log in to the next machine legitimately. Not an exploit at all, a login. Correct username, correct password, correct permissions from a machine that was entitled to ask. There is no patch for that, because nothing is broken. The system is working exactly as designed. And if the credentials it found happened to belong to an administrator, someone whose account works on every machine in the company, then the malware inherited that reach instantly. One compromised laptop, one administrator session left logged in on it. Every machine in the organization reachable with credentials that were entirely valid. That is the actual lesson of NotPetya, and it is an architecture lesson, not a malware lesson. So that is how it moved. Now, what did it actually do when it arrived on a machine? It displayed a ransom note, red text, black screen, a Bitcoin address, a demand for $300, and instructions for getting your files back. It looked like ransomware. It was reported as ransomware for the first day or so. It resembled an earlier string closely enough that the name people reached for was Petya, which is why we ended up calling this one NotPetya. It was not ransomware. It was a wiper wearing a ransomware costume. Researchers established quickly that pain could not work. Not that the attackers chose not to decrypt, but that the design made recovery impossible. The information you would need to get your data back was never kept. There was nothing to send you, whatever you paid, which reframes the entire event. A criminal wants your money and therefore needs you to believe that recovery is possible because the business model collapses the moment word gets round that paying does nothing. Something that takes payments it cannot honor is not running a business, it is running a disguise. The ransom note was camouflage. For the first hours of the response, and for the story told afterwards. And a company that believes it has a ransomware incident makes very different decisions in the first hour than a company that already knows its data is simply gone for good. Most of the world found out which one it had on the 27th of June. Ha! Ha! It started in Ukraine, and in Ukraine it was comprehensive. Banks, government ministries, the power grid, the postal service, the metro, the airport. Reports from that day described radiation monitors at the Chernobyl site being switched to manual. For a few hours, the administrative layer of a European country stopped working. Not the internet in Ukraine, the things that use it, which turns out to be everything. And then it left, for the reason we established earlier. Multinational offices are not walls. They are doors, and doors open in both directions. It reached Denmark, the United States, Germany, France, India, Australia. Anywhere a company with a Ukrainian office had a network, which is most large companies. Maersk, the world's largest container shipping company. Merck, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. TNT Express, the logistics arm of FedEx. Saint-Gobain in France, Mondelez, which makes a large fraction of the snacks in your supermarket, Reckitt Benckiser, and Rosneft in Russia, which is a footnote we will come back to. None of these companies had any connection to Ukrainian tax law beyond having an office there. And this is where I want to stop using the phrase cyber attack for a moment, because that phrase makes people picture stolen data and nothing else. Data was not the interesting casualty. Physical things stopped. Terminals at ports could not tell which container was which, or where it was supposed to go next, or who owned the thing inside it. Ships arrived and could not be unloaded, because unloading a container ship is an information problem before it is a crane problem. Trucks queued at gates that could not read their paperwork. Refrigerated containers of perishable goods sat with nobody able to establish where they were meant to go. A meaningful share of world trade moves through a small number of terminals, and several of them stopped working on the same afternoon. That is the thing about attacking logistics rather than a bank. Logistics is the layer that everything else quietly assumes is already working. And the response inside these companies was, in a specific way, worse than you would imagine. Because every tool you would normally use to manage an incident is also a computer, and every one of those computers was in the same condition as the rest. Email is gone. The phone directory was on a server that is gone. The incident response plan is a document on a file share that is gone. The system that tells you which machines you own and where they are is gone. Staff at affected companies described running their response on personal phones and handwritten lists, coordinating a global recovery through a group chat. Ports were reportedly run for days on paper, phone calls, and human memory. And I want to give credit where it is genuinely due, because it gets lost underneath the numbers. Those companies kept operating, not well and not fully, but ships were unloaded and goods moved by people improvising without any of the tools their jobs are built on. The recovery from NotPetya is genuinely one of the great operational stories in the history of computing, and almost none of it was technical. But one company's version of that recovery is remembered above all of the others, and the reason has almost nothing to do with skill or preparation. It has to do with a power cut in Ghana. Maersk moves a substantial fraction of the world's containerized freight. On the 27th of June, it lost, by reported figures, 45,000 PCs and 4,000 servers. Not damaged, useless. The entire computing estate of a global shipping company at once. But the number that actually mattered was very much smaller than either of those. And to explain why, I need to explain one piece of unglamorous plumbing. Every large organization runs a directory service. Active Directory, in most cases. It is the list of who exists, what they are allowed to do, and which machines belong to the company. It is how a computer knows you are you. Without it, a freshly rebuilt machine is not a company machine. It is a blank laptop that cannot prove who anybody is, connected to a network that will not let it do anything. So the recovery order is not negotiable. Directory first, everything else depends on it. Maersk ran roughly 150 domain controllers, the servers that hold that directory spread across the world. 150 of them, deliberately, for resilience. They constantly synchronize with one another precisely so that no single failure anywhere can take the directory away from you, which is excellent protection against fire, flood, and hardware failure, and precisely no protection against this, because a network that replicates faithfully will faithfully replicate a wiper. Reporting on the incident is consistent. Maersk lost all of its online domain controllers and the backups with them. Read that the way an engineer would. Not most of them, not the primary site. The list of who works here and what they are permitted to touch was gone in every location that happened to be switched on. You cannot rebuild from that. You can only start a new company that happens to own the same ships. And then somebody found one? In Accra, in Ghana, there was one domain controller that still held a clean, uncorrupted copy of the entire directory. It survived because it was switched off. There had been a blackout, and the power cut had knocked it off the network before the attack ever arrived. A local power failure, an infrastructure problem, an ordinary irritation, the sort of thing a regional office complains about, is the reason the recovery was possible. I have thought about that fact for a long time, and I still cannot turn it into a comfortable lesson because the honest version of it is unflattering to everybody. The best prepared parts of that network were destroyed by their own good design. The part that survived did so by being disconnected, by accident, for a reason nobody chose. There is a real principle buried in the luck, and it is this: replication is not backup. Two copies that talk to each other are one copy with extra steps. If a change on one becomes a change on the other, you have redundancy against hardware and none against events. The only thing that saved Maersk was a copy that was incapable of receiving an update, offline, disconnected, unreachable, and therefore untouched. That is what an offline backup is, and NotPetya is the most expensive argument for it ever staged. And the copy still had to be moved. It was in West Africa, the recovery effort was in Europe. The link was too slow to move what was needed, so as reported by Wired, whose account of this remains the definitive one, the data had to travel physically, carried by people onto airplanes. The recovery of one of the world's largest shipping companies depended, at one point, on cargo in the oldest sense of the word. Rebuilding the directory took about 9 days. 9 days before the foundation was back, and only then could the rest begin. Then 45,000 PCs and 4,000 servers reinstalled one at a time over the following weeks by staff working in shifts around the clock. The reported cost to Maersk is around $300 million, and that figure is the estimate the company itself indicated. For a company that was never attacked, that was never a target of anything, whose only mistake was having an office in a country where a tax program had been compromised. And Maersk was one company. The bill was much larger. Merck, the pharmaceutical company, reported damages of around $870 million. Manufacturing disrupted, operations halted, and production of some medicines affected for months afterwards, which is a supply problem for patients, not only a balance sheet problem for a company. TNT Express, the FedEx subsidiary, reported losses of more than $400 million, and its integration into FedEx was set back significantly. Those three companies on their own come to more than $1.5 billion, and they are 3 names on a list that runs a great deal longer. Estimates of the global total exceed $10 billion. That figure originated as a government estimate, and it is exactly that, an estimate, not an audited number. But even treating it skeptically, it puts NotPetya in a category of 1. No other cyber incident has been credibly argued to sit anywhere near that range. And here is the part that I think is genuinely underappreciated, and it is why this attack changed the industry rather than just breaking it. Not one of these companies had budgeted for this, because not one of them believed they were the target. Their risk models asked who would want to attack us, and what would they be after? Reasonable questions, and completely the wrong ones. Nobody wanted to attack Mondelez. Nobody was after a chocolate manufacturer's data, and no ransom was ever going to be collected from a biscuit factory. They were standing next to something, on the same network as something, and the something was not aimed at them. But, which means the question is not, am I a target? It is, whose blast radius am I standing in, and that is a much harder question, because it depends on other people's enemies. And then the bills arrived, and every one of these companies did the same entirely sensible thing that any business would do. They claimed on their insurance, and that is where NotPetya stopped being a security story and became something with much longer consequences, because the insurers said no. Not on a technicality about coverage limits or unpatched systems. On a much older clause, property insurance policies have carried an exclusion for hostile or warlike action for a very long time. Long enough that the wording predates computers entirely. The reasoning is straightforward and predates computers. A war is not a risk you can price, because losses are correlated and unbounded. So the insurers made an argument that had never really been tested. This was not vandalism or crime. It was one nation attacking another, and the companies were collateral damage in someone else's conflict. Merck's dispute alone involved claims in the region of $1.3 billion. Now sit with the position that puts a company in. You bought insurance against catastrophic loss. The loss happened, and you are told it does not count because it was catastrophic in the wrong way. This mattered far beyond Maersk, because if that argument had won, every cyber insurance policy in the world would have had a hole in it. Serious attacks are increasingly state-linked. An exclusion for state-linked attacks would have excluded exactly the events people buy the insurance for. So a court had to decide what a phrase written about armies, decades before any of this existed, means when it is applied to a piece of software. In December 2021, the New Jersey Superior Court ruled for Maersk. The hostile and warlike action exclusion did not apply. The appellate court upheld it. The insurers had not shown that this attack was hostile or warlike in the way the insurance industry had always used those words. The reasoning is the genuinely interesting part. The clause had been written and understood for decades to mean armed conflict between states. Tanks, not code. Maersk later reached a confidential settlement. Mondelez settled its own case separately, but the ruling had already done its work. That ruling is the reason cyber insurance looks the way it does today. Policies were rewritten across the market. War exclusions specific to cyber were drafted, argued over, withdrawn, and redrafted, and they are still being argued over today. An entire industry had to define, in contract language, what counts as an act of war when the weapon is a software update. That work is not finished. And underneath it sits a question the law is still catching up with, which is, how do you know who did it? On attribution. This case is unusually well documented, and I want to be precise about what is established and what is alleged. What is established is that governments made a public attribution. The United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Denmark each attributed NotPetya to Russia's military intelligence service, the GRU. That is a matter of record. Those statements were made publicly by those governments. The group named in that attribution is generally known as Sandworm, described as operating within the GRU. And in 2020, the United States Department of Justice indicted 6 Russian military officers in connection with the attack. Now, the careful part, and I am going to be explicit about it, because this is where a lot of coverage gets sloppy in a way that matters. An indictment is an accusation. It is a prosecutor's allegation that a crime was committed by named individuals. It is not a verdict. None of those 6 has been tried. None has been convicted. They are outside the jurisdiction of the court that charged them, and, realistically, they are not going to appear in it. So everything in that indictment is what the United States government alleges happened. I am not going to name those 6 people on this channel because they are accused and untried, and naming them adds nothing you need. What the indictment does give you is a public, documented account of what one government says happened, which is more than exists for almost any other attack of this scale. And that itself was part of the point. Indicting officers who will never stand trial is not really about the trial. It is about putting evidence on the public record and turning an anonymous event into an attributed one. Which brings us to the strategic reading of NotPetya. And it is the one I keep coming back to 9 years later. If the intent was to disrupt Ukraine, it succeeded and then dramatically overshot. Estimated $10 billion of damage, most of it to companies in countries that were not part of the conflict, including, and this is not a small detail, companies in Russia. Rosneft was affected. Whatever this was designed to do, hitting the attacker's own national champion was not on the plan. That tells you something important about the class of weapon. Self-propagating code does not have a target list. It has a reachability graph, and the graph is drawn by everybody else. It goes everywhere it can go, and everywhere it can go is not a quantity anyone can calculate in advance, because it depends on every network it will ever touch. A missile has a range. This does not have a range. It has a topology, and nobody has a map of it. That is the argument every serious person made after 2017, and it is why NotPetya turns up in arms control discussions rather than only at security conferences. 9 years on, the technical lessons are well absorbed. Patching, segmentation, offline backups, restricting administrator credentials. All of it is standard advice now, and NotPetya is the reason a lot of it became standard. The strategic lesson is not absorbed at all. We still have no working answer for what a company is owed when it is destroyed by a conflict it has no part in, and no method of attribution that would satisfy a court to a criminal standard. What we have instead is a rewritten insurance clause, which is a strange monument to the most expensive cyber attack in history. So let me give you the part you can actually use, because there are 4 things here, and they are not abstract. 1. Replication is not backup. If your second copy updates automatically from your first copy, you have protection against the disk failing and none against anything that corrupts or deletes. Maersk had 150 synchronized copies of the thing it could not lose and lost all of them at the same instant. The copy that saved the company was the one that could not be reached. Whatever you cannot afford to lose, one copy of it needs to be somewhere that cannot receive an instruction. That is the entire principle, and it applies to a company or a laptop. 2. Your risk is not only your own risk. Ask what your machines can reach and, much more importantly, what can reach them from somewhere you do not control. Every company hit here was hit through a connection that existed for a good reason. A branch office, a supplier, a piece of software everybody had to run. The practical version: if a machine in the smallest office you have were fully taken over tonight, what would it be able to reach by morning? If the answer is everything, that is the finding. 3. Administrative accounts are the actual perimeter. The malware did not need to break anything to spread. It used credentials that were already valid. Which means an admin account logged in on an ordinary desktop is not a convenience. It is the entire estate sitting on one machine, waiting. So keep separate accounts for administration and do not use them for email or browsing. That single habit would have limited the spread inside almost every company on that list. 4. Your incident plan cannot live on the thing that breaks. Contact lists, network diagrams, recovery procedures, if they only exist on the systems being recovered, you do not have them. Companies ran a global recovery from personal phones and paper because everything else was gone. That was improvisation. It should have been a plan. Print it, or keep it somewhere with no relationship to your production systems at all. It is the cheapest item on this list by a very long way. And one thing that is not a takeaway, but is the actual reason I wanted to cover this particular episode rather than a more dramatic one. Most security stories have a villain and a mistake, and if you fix the mistake, you are safe. This one does not fit that shape. The companies were not careless. Doing the recommended thing, installing a signed update from a trusted vendor, is what delivered the malware. Maersk's directory was destroyed by exactly the resilience design that best practice recommends, and rescued by an accident nobody planned. Which is uncomfortable to say on a channel like this one, and I think being honest about it is considerably more useful than a checklist that quietly pretends otherwise. Some risk is structural. It comes from being connected to the world, and the only real defenses are the boring ones. Limit what one compromise reaches, and keep one copy of everything somewhere nothing can touch. Neither of those is exciting. Both of them would have saved hundreds of millions of dollars on the 27th of June, 2017. If this was worth half an hour, following the channel genuinely helps. It is the signal that tells the algorithm to show this to somebody else. And I would like your view on the insurance question because I do not think it is settled. If a company is destroyed by a state's attack on a different country, who should pay? The comments are the right place, and I read them. Next Monday. The hack that changed everything goes back to the very beginning, to 1988, and the first time this happened at all. Episode 5 is the maersk worm, a graduate student's experiment that took down a large part of the early internet, apparently by accident, and produced the first conviction of its kind anywhere. If NotPetya is what this looks like with a state behind it, the maersk worm is what it looked like when one person wrote something and got a number wrong. Same shape, 30 years apart. Code that copies itself. And a blast radius nobody calculated. A tax program in Ukraine. An estimated $10 billion of damage. And one server in Ghana that happened to be switched off at exactly the right moment. I am Niels. That was the hack that changed everything. Go and check where your backups actually live.